Welcome to Redirect, Immigration Law and Perspectives, a weekly dive into the world of immigration law and its human consequences. I'm your host, Stephen Robbins, and a little bit later in the show, we are doing an interview. It was a live interview that we did for a CLE yesterday with Professor Alina. She's a professor of law at New York University School of Law and the author of No Justice in the Shadows, How America Criminalizes Immigrants. And in the meantime, I'm joined by Austin Kocher, friend of the show.
Hey, everyone.
Say hi to the folks.
Sure.
Now, Austin, have you read this book?
No, it's sitting on my shelf with a stack of books I need to get to, but I've been tweaking all week over election results and have not gotten to it.
Right. Well, put down the Twitter for a minute and move this book to the top of your stack. It's a really good book, and I think it's important because, we are now in a position where the president could make moves. Like, I'm not saying they're going to happen. The new president could make moves that help immigrants. And we need to not just push him to do that, but we need to be influencers on our friends and family when it comes to getting them to see immigrants not as criminals or even necessarily as immigrants, but just as like regular people. So the book does a good job of giving some anecdotes and other information that I think can change minds. So,
yeah. And Alina is I've read a lot of her other work, probably most of her other work. She's just one of the smartest people out there right now. So I'm excited about that interview.
Yeah, it's actually on YouTube. People can check it out. We streamed it live. I figured out the technology. I know how to stream live now, and pretty soon I'll be playing NES games on Twitch, making my money that way, maybe.
Well, let's not say you haven't learned anything in 2020 then. It's not like nothing good. It's not like nothing good has come of 2020. You're on Twitch,
Frankly, I think that this kind of, it doesn't get us all the way there, but it gets us pretty close to balancing the scales of 2020.
Yeah.
So, Austin, as of right now, which is Friday, almost noon here on the West Coast, it looks like Joe Biden has basically done the thing.
Yeah.
It also looks like maybe for the first time ever, we have a president who just doesn't believe that. And you're getting this sort of concerned Mitt Romney responses. You're getting some milquetoast. But
yeah, of course.
A lot of other Republicans seem, inclined to sort of go along with this idea that there's fraud when there's not. So what's going to happen is what I'm asking.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm watching this unfold too. And everyone seems to be kind of distancing themselves, but not actually, coming out and taking a stand for, I don't know, democracy and if not the rule of law, at least the rule of math. It's just counting and Biden is up. It's not,
Right.
So
I think it's mysterious that isn't it so mysterious though that
that they keep finding all of these ballots inside of ballot boxes and,
some votes got counted first and then other votes got counted later. Isn't that weird?
Yeah. It's really strange.
Super suspicious. They should look into that.
Yeah.
Well, do you want to lay down a hot take in terms of a prediction? What happens between now and Inauguration Day?
As far as the election, there's two big things that are on my mind when I think about the next 3 months. And one is just the general security of the country. Mm-hmm. I read something just this morning about, there are people who study conflict surrounding elections in lots of countries in the world. And it turns out that a lot of the conflict and even concerns around violence and things like that happen not right after the election, but actually the longer it gets drawn out. So one concern that I have just generally is, are we going to be able to manage the temperature of the country in a way that won't lead to, people actually getting hurt and, and that kind of thing. So I don't know. I think it's probably not, I don't think that we're going into some civil war or anything. I think that's sensationalistic, but I think it's entirely plausible. We've seen over the last 4 years, it would make sense that there would be some concern around just basic security. There's just nothing about Trump's claims or his son's claims at this point that have any merit. And if you read, as I'm sure you did,
I mean,
like
it
I
does
did.
seem weird, though. It does seem weird. That's the argument.
Yeah, everything seems weird when you don't understand how systems work. It seems weird that they don't go your way.
Knowing nothing about this system, Your Honor, I'm just looking at this and it seems weird. So, motion to redo the election, please. That's basically the argument.
Yeah.
In court. I mean, I do think there's a scenario. You saw there was a person arrested. I think I don't remember where, but they were headed to Michigan, I think, to do stuff with guns. And what we've seen with the president in the past, with Kyle Rittenhouse or in Charlottesville, he has a real keen knack for sort of nodding and winking. Or sometimes just flat out saying like he's a good he's a good dude. But even when he doesn't do that, he did this with the kidnappers, right? The plotters sort of, you shouldn't kidnap a governor, but we
need to look into this.
She is kind of a bitch. And so that sort of a thing. My fear is not full out civil war. I mean, I guess that's in the back of my psyche, but more like a half a dozen of these things popping off and the president sort of giving his signal, his tacit approval. And then the question, I think, at that point becomes, are the forces around him, the Republican Party, willing to stand up and say, all right, like that's good. This is enough. Or are they going to continue to parrot these sort of talking points about we've been robbed and, so on and so forth? I don't know. I mean, but
it's a real concern. I mean, Lindsey Graham, who is always ready to ride on the coattails of anyone who has a profile at the moment, has gone on TV supporting and reinforcing very loosely and obviously with no evidence whatsoever, the president's claims about election fraud. But aside from him and some of the cranks, which are his family members, Trump's family members, of course, and his sons who have been promoting this, I mean, I haven't really seen anyone come out in explicit support, and it's frustrating the Trump campaign. So Don Jr. has been tweeting at all these Republicans, demanding that people come out and support their accusations of fraudulent votes, of course, totally baseless. And so it's satisfying to me to see them frustrated with the Republican Party and to see that internal fighting take over their energy. They're also, of course, all upset with Fox News for calling Arizona before anyone else did in favor of Biden. So I think, they're just going to keep punching at whoever's closest to them. The campaign will. And I think that's probably just going to absorb the majority of their energy, but I don't know.
Right. The good thing is it does seem like there's strong claims to a handful of states that give him the win. And so the odds of a 2000 redo don't seem very likely. I mean, it's the Supreme Court. You never know if all of these cases were to be, consolidated, make their way up to the Supreme Court. He has different theories in different states. In some states, they need to count, and in other states, they're supposed to stop, and there's no coherence. But the fact that it's not like just Nevada that's making the difference or just Pennsylvania, I think really helps us settle in terms of the actual law. But we'll see. My other prediction, hot take, I tweeted this, is that he's going to quit. He's not about to accept these results, but he'll have something to say about how the forces of the fake news media conspired against him and his family. He made America great. He did it. Mission accomplished. And actually, because of the obstruction of the media and the Democrats, he can better serve America by doing rallies and starting like a Patreon page or something. I think he quits. There's no way they do the, sitting together in the White House photo op and then the inauguration. There's no way. He doesn't have the character for it. So
no. And ironically, like, he doesn't have the leadership to actually mount any sort of sustained movement in his favor. All he has is a Twitter account and someone else paying some attorney's fees. He really doesn't have the capacity to lead anyone. So the question around volatility with him in a moment like this isn't that he will be able to follow through with anything. It's that he'll enable and provoke a bunch of other people to take up his cause and trying to get into election centers, and they're, people with assault rifles are standing around polling places in Phoenix and things like that. So, I mean, that's the most he can do. But I think you're right. I think he goes away and this is just his way of trying to maintain some sense of, he's like an evil Michael Scott from The Office. Everything bad that happens is someone else's fault, not his. It's never his own incompetence. So, I mean, I think I think you're right about that.
Yeah. So I want to ask you, we talked about this, I think last week. At one point in like 2014, one of our early shows, we had David Leopold and Matthew Culkin on.
Oh, and interesting.
We had them on separately, and neither one knew that the other one was going to be on. And they were both furious when they found out they were on a show technically together, but separate.
Oh, of course.
And David was an ally of the Obama administration. I think he was, pretty close to people within the administration. And he was of the mindset of, we have to insulate the president from critiques, even if they're somewhat valid. We need to pull some punches because ultimately he's an ally, right?
Yeah.
And we're going to get immigration reform on the back end someday. And Matthew Culkin, who has gone full Trumpist, and that's a whole other thing, but at the time was sort of like your regular libertarian, whatever, that's a whole other conversation. But he was saying, no, we should speak truth to power, and Obama's terrible, so we should critique him as such. And I'm worried going into this administration that people's instinct will be to fall into, with all due respect to David, that sort of mindset. We've got to insulate Biden. We've got to protect him, and we've got to let him do his thing. So how do you think people need to approach this administration in terms of immigration? What are some of the pitfalls you see and problem spots?
Yeah, great question. This is basically the question that I was going to ask you today too, or bring. So those are the two versions of that are the two main conversations that are even happening this week and today. The two versions as they've evolved from like the Obama administration is, on the one hand, we've got an analysis that says the institutions have completely failed, and any attempts to reform them or to advocate for incremental change within them and through the normal systems has so clearly failed us because of the legacy of the Obama administration's deportations and family detention and all of that, as well as a real shift, I think, in the national conversation around just general issues of policing and criminal justice, which have gone from 10 years ago, the question was mass incarceration, and everyone sort of got on board with like decreasing incarceration. But since then, that conversation has also pushed much more into the territory of abolition. And so abolition is just a big keyword in how we think about the state and legal institutions and criminal justice institutions and the immigration system. So a big part of the conversation right now is a very hard line. We need to push from the outside, no matter who's in the White House, for, if not complete abolition, massive, massive fundamental structural change. The other side of that conversation, or the other part of the conversation, would be more in line with David's from the past, which is, look, we know that Biden was not good on immigration during the Obama administration. We know that they had policies that we disagree with, but Biden is a politician that evolves. He has, in some instances, apologized or acknowledged that the policies of the Obama administration were not the best. And, he's come a long way on criminal justice. And he has a vice president who has a stronger immigration background and has taken, at least publicly taken, much more progressive immigration policy stances. I don't know that we have to decide between the two necessarily or adjudicate that debate, but I do think that that is the debate that will probably carry us into 2021. And just watching it and sort of analyzing what's going on and keeping pace, I think what people should be looking for is what kind of concrete steps does Biden take in the early days and weeks and months of the administration if the election results hold? What does he do substantively? I would say that if Biden does take immediate positive action, let's say, securing DACA, turning back some of Trump's or many of Trump's, immigration policies, ending the migrant protection protocols that have forced many thousands of migrants to wait in Mexico for their asylum hearings. If he takes swift action on that, I think it could actually help head off a kind of bigger internal fight about which of those two approaches is best. If people see substantive change, I think the concern will be if he doesn't take meaningful change early on, I think that debate is going to rev up and be more serious. And so that's what I see. And that's what I'm looking for is I just want to see what the actual policies are like and see what the consequences are.
And the appointments too. I mean, those names are going to be floated, right? We got to be paying attention to that sort of thing too, right?
Yeah, especially Attorney General. I want to see who he's thinking about for Attorney General. And, we want to see someone who's going to turn back the policies that Bill Barr and Jeff Sessions have put in place. Shout
out to Matthew Whitaker. Doesn't get any credit, but, he did his part too.
Yeah.
So I'm just remembering this. I might have told this story before, but in 2013, I went with Ayla, the Washington chapter of the American Immigration Lawyers Association, to Washington for a conference and also to do some lobbying because immigration reform, people were saying it's not whether it passes, it's what's going to be in it because it passed the Senate and they said they had the votes in the House and it was a thing that was in the minds of many definitely going to happen and it didn't. But it was me and some lawyers from the west side of the state, the big cities. And then there was one sort of and I say this endearingly, sort of granola activist guy, like a crunchy leftist who, we were all there to really encourage them to support it and, blah, 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 and talk about certain specific issues. And he was there to just say we need open borders and amnesty for all of them. And this bill doesn't go far enough because it leaves so many people out. Mm-hmm. And at one point, one of the lawyers from Seattle got him up against the wall in the congressional office building and was like, "We're not here for this bullshit. We're trying to get something actually done, and this isn't the time and the place." And so I'm sympathetic with the guy's positions, and I agree with him that bill fell short, but the reality is when you're trying to get something passed, at a certain point, you do have to start talking about some concessions and what can realistically pass. And because immigration has been poison pilled a bunch of different times. And so anyways, I don't always know where that line is. And maybe there's a role for both people, right? The lobbying lawyers and the angsty organizers. I don't know, but I do think we should be as aggressive as possible starting now as they're setting the table. It's going to be harder if we wait and try and do it, further on down the road. So,
so thinking about that, when you think about the time between now and day one, January 20th, 2021, if Biden is finally declared president-elect, what are the conversations that you would want people to be having about what to look for and how to be thinking about and talking about this moment? What are the things that stick out to you, or even things that you wish that activists who maybe the rhetoric feels very aggressive, but what are things that you hope that they just understand factually and realistically about what can happen? What would be the kind of things that you would encourage people to think about?
The thing that's starting to stand out to me, for even just looking at this election and where Democrats had some success, is just trying to get people involved locally in your small bore issues and engaged in your local politics, I think is a good thing for people to do. And then people should know, I know I have family that listens to this podcast or people who are not lawyers who care about these issues. People need to understand day one of a Biden administration, the immigration system will look exactly like it does now with all the terrible things in place, the machinery up and rolling, and it will take affirmative actions on the part of the administration to reshape it. And so we've got to be calling for those things because I do think the longer it continues, if we're at day 5 and then we're at day 20 and then we're at day 180, some of those things, suddenly they become bipartisan, right? They've become part of both a Republican administration and a Democratic administration. And it just becomes so much harder. So I'm sure there's groups, I don't know who they are, but putting together, we should find out, putting together specific lists of the easiest immigration things to roll back that he can do without Congress. And we should look into that. Do you know anyone putting together a list like that?
I've come across some things online, mostly individuals who are sort of stream of consciousness, thoughts about things that can change. Now looks like we're getting a vision of what's going to happen with the election. I anticipate probably more organizations, American Immigration Council, and probably lots of others will be putting together more specific points. You know, one thing that I'm also already thinking about, because I work at a place that studies the federal government, work at TRAC. And, you know, we track the immigration data, deportations, arrests, you know, the immigration cases that are before the court. And that work is sort of data driven and it's just kind of objective, nonpartisan stuff. But, you know, we've tracked what's going on in the Trump administration. We've seen increased rates of asylum denial. We've seen cases moving faster. We've written about a lot of these things. We've written about fewer immigrants having representation in court in some cases, especially with the border cases. So, you know, one thing that I'm thinking about too is like, okay, we get a change in administration. There's always a question about rhetoric versus reality. And I'm just myself, just sort of frankly curious to see what happens with the data, because you can talk a good game, but if the asylum denial rates stay high, if MPP remains in place, if some of those other, you know, numbers don't change, I think it's going to be hard to substantiate the rhetoric that the administration is better on immigration. So, I mean, we'll just kind of see. We'll have to see how it, you know, from my perspective as a researcher, I'm curious to see how that turns out. Yeah, you can bet we'll be writing about it.
Over the next couple of weeks, let's look for organizations or a list. Yeah. Maybe we could make our own of like, hey, these are things that day one pretty seamlessly we could go back to. But if they're going to roll the clock back, they should make sure and roll it back to 2014 Obama, not 2009 Obama.
Yeah.
And there's no need to put up with this sort of like, we got to be tough so that we can compromise. I think that, you know, sort of pipe dream is dead. The Republicans are not acting in good faith on immigration. So we got to do what we can with the power that we have. But it was really good talking to you. And let's keep an eye out for those things. All right.
Likewise. Thanks. Good chat.
All right. You too. Take care.
Yep. See ya.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to this afternoon session. We are featuring Professor Alina Doss, Professor of Clinical Law at NYU, and she is the author of No Justice in the Shadows, How America Criminalizes Immigrants. Matthew Archambault is an attorney in Philadelphia, and Stephen Robbins is an attorney in Yakima. Together, Matthew and Stephen host a really great immigration law and policy podcast called Redirect. My name is Tony Lee. I'm a third-year law student at the University of Idaho here in Boise and a volunteer with Immigrant Justice Idaho.
Great.
Thank you, Anthony.
Well, we have a podcast. I mean, I don't know that it's all those other things that you said, but this is really exciting, Matthew.
Yeah, finally.
Be talking to, here's the book, proof that I have it. And
love to see it.
Yes, I did all the homework. Professor Doss, tell us a little bit about the book.
Sure. So the book is called No Justice in the Shadows, How America Criminalizes.
Hold on just a second. Matthew?
Yeah, I don't have the book with me. But,
all right.
Matthew.
This is what I've been reading lately. So.
Oh, boring. Oh, sorry.
It's on my bedstand.
Wow.
Sorry. Well, I actually thought this was tomorrow, so
it's all right. It's available at your local bookstores, by independent, and at libraries. So the book is really a book, as the title says, No Justice in the Shadows. I talk about that title in part because think we spend so much time talking about how immigrants need to come out of the shadows that we don't spend enough time talking about why the shadows exist in the first place. And the criminalization of immigrants is really intentional. So the book is tracing that history, why we target immigrants, why we rely so heavily on the criminal legal system to target immigrants, and then using stories of some of my clients, people that I've had the privilege of representing along with my students at NYU Law School. We are really trying to unpack the system, this deportation pipeline, and explain why deportation policy shouldn't be thought of as a tool for protecting public safety, that it really does the opposite, that it harms our communities, and that we need to really dismantle the deportation machinery and also untangle the connection between the criminal legal system and the deportation system.
And actually, thank you so much for the book, because so much is spent on, so many advocates, and I think maybe well-meaning people want to talk about like the perfect immigrant, that DACA student who's a valedictorian, and they'll want to kind of keep the people that you're talking about kind of out of the conversation. And some of my favorite clients have been those with criminal backgrounds, and not only minor criminal backgrounds, some pretty serious stuff. But as a society, we have to kind of decide like how we want to treat people. Do we want to treat people with grace, or do you want to be punitive for everything? I'm glad that you're speaking about it, because there is like so much value to I think everyone has something to offer of value. And so often that value is so greatly diminished because of maybe a DUI that someone had, 20 years ago, or quite frankly, even maybe a more serious crime. But everyone deserves some grace in something. I'm glad that you're talking about it.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate that. I think it's one of those things where it's understandable. Like people who have grown up in immigrant communities, immigrant households, we've lived our whole lives being told that we're lucky to be here, that we have to work hard and earn our place in this country. And while I understand those sentiments, I grew up with those sentiments. At the end of the day, it distracts us from the reality of really figuring out why is it so difficult to immigrate here in the first place? Why do we have these rules? And why are immigrants so often treated as suspects, treated as people who are always going to be perpetual outsiders and threats, having to prove ourselves? And that mentality, even if you do everything right, even if you are the valedictorian, that mentality is still what keeps immigrant communities from really thriving in the United States. And I think we've obviously seen that under the Trump administration. He has used every trope in the book to talk about immigrants as criminals, as people who are just draining the public coffers. He's using all of those descriptions, and it demonstrates how being the valedictorian, being the perfect person, is not enough to save you. And so part of the reason I wrote this book is to say, like, we're not going to really see progress if we keep allowing our own communities to be divided into good and bad. And that we have to really shift the focus back to the government and why these policies exist in the first place. And a lot of what I talk about in the book is how it's really driven from racism, from anti-Blackness, from these kind of foundational principles that back in the day were really explicit, that we have these immigration laws in order to preserve whiteness at the foundations of the U.S. when it's first being formed. And that continues to this day, even when we're not being so explicit about it.
I want to play a clip real quick of this guy, Joe Biden. You might remember him. He was confronted by some protesters at some point during the campaign. I guess it looks like it was about a year ago. And he was asked to apologize for the 3 million deportations that he was part of as vice president. He refused to do that. And then he was asked to commit to stopping all deportations. And this is what he had to say.
I want to know if you will commit to stopping all deportations if you are elected president.
No. Not all deportations. I would make sure that every single...
Will you apologize for the 3 million deportations under the Obama administration?
No. What I will...
3 million deportations under the Obama administration!
I think I missed the clip. That's a classic redirect move. What he says is that he obviously, in his mind, very obviously would not stop the deportation of felons. That's an obvious thing. Why on earth would you do that? But if you have a misdemeanor, then okay, right? Then like he's maybe willing to give you some space. And it does feel like that's almost a reflexive type of position for people to have. Talk about the flaws in that type of thinking and why people who feel that way might want to rethink their position.
Sure. I mean, it really is a signature part of the past Obama-Biden administration. And Obama said it best himself in his 2014 speech, where he said we should be deporting felons and not families, right? It's like this divide that exists in people's heads, but it doesn't exist in real life. And these are some of the stories that I tell in my book. One of the chapters follows the story of a woman named Abba in the book. And Abba is this woman who is dropping her 4-year-old off at school. And as she turns out of the building, this is in the Bronx, New York, and it's in the Obama years. She turns out of the building and suddenly she sees these officers surrounding her, and they're holding up a picture, and it's a picture of her from the worst day of her life. It's 8 years prior when she was arrested and eventually convicted of a felony. And so she's that person, right, that the past administration of the Obama-Biden administration was talking about, deport felons, not families. But when you look at her, right, so yes, she has a felony conviction. For her, she was pregnant with her 3rd child. She was about to be evicted from her home. She asked her boss if she could get an advance on her paycheck to pay the rent. He said no. And so she made the choice to take some money from her boss, thinking that she would put it back the next week and that no one would notice. He noticed, he called the police, she was arrested. The police actually this is in New York, the police saw her and they were like, oh, wow, this is an 8-month pregnant woman who's about to be evicted. We're not actually going to take her to jail. She ends up getting probation, but she does plead to a felony. And as a result, she spends the next 5 years paying back every cent she took. And it's the biggest shame in her life. But she does what the criminal legal system asked her to do. And she actually got a little modicum of forgiveness in that system, which is a surprise. And there she is 8 years later, living her life, taking care of her U.S. citizen children. And she is arrested by ICE and taken away to a jail. And, for those kids, she was too ashamed. She didn't want the kids to come see her in jail. She had never been in jail before. And so the first time those kids saw her was when we were forced as her lawyers to bring them to court, because we knew the judge deciding for bond needed to see the kids to make a decision. And we were lucky enough to have fought for a decision at the time that gave her the right to the bond hearing, because of her felony, she's actually not eligible for a bond hearing. But we were able to have that day in court. We brought those kids, and that 4-year-old saw his mother for the first time wearing a uniform, a jumpsuit, with her feet shackled. And he cried so hard that the judge ordered him out of the courtroom, ordered his dad to take him out of the courtroom. And when I think about that, she was granted bond. She eventually was able to get her green card through this process. And I think about that and the harm it created to that family. Government policies, immigration policies, at a minimum, they should be producing good, solving problems. But all I see, especially when people get this double punishment on top of an old criminal conviction and they're put in the system, is harm. It's just taking someone after they've gotten their life together, disrupting it all over again, and harming their families and communities in the process. I'm hoping that Biden is willing to learn, and I think we've heard a little bit in more recent conversations and in the last debate, perhaps an acknowledgement that mistakes were made and things need to change. And so I trust in our communities to push him to do better this time around, again, with the footnote being that we don't know yet that he's getting this time around, but that's my hope.
I think one thing that will go around with when immigration lawyers are talking to each other, they're just kind of commiserating about cases. They'll have a client and you'll say, have you ever been arrested? And they'll say no. And then you do a little research and you say, hey, what about that time back in 2005 when you were arrested for whatever? They're like, oh, yeah, but I took care of that. I paid all of that. And we kind of laugh like, yeah, but you were arrested. We have to put that down. But they are right. I mean, they're not, from a moral standpoint, they paid it all. They did what they had to do. But now we're there to remind them, okay, it might be 15 years later, and now you have to account for that again. And Alina, as you say, they can be totally different people at that time. And that is real frustrating. Like, I don't share that much optimism with Biden that he's going to fix this part. I saw one tweet where some legal analysis said, oh, rest assured, Biden is going to do XXX, whatever, with immigration. And I think as a community, like, we cannot rest right assured of anything. So I think it's up to all of us to, push on these parts. And I think your book is a good starting point.
Yeah. And I think that that's part of the lesson that we got from the Obama years, is that we all gave President Obama a lot of space in the beginning to do what we thought he was going to do, right? Like to put an immigration plan forward, to really create opportunities. And instead, he did this kind of political gamble where he said, if I want to create that political space, so I'm going to be really tough on folks. I'm going to deport, they'll go after the worst of the worst. I'm going to expand programs like Secure Communities, which is like this fingerprinting program that shares people's data if they're arrested for anything, no matter what happens. Like, used all of this machinery. I expanded the machinery of deportation. And we never got, what was supposed to come out of that bargain, which is some sort of, okay, well, now we can actually talk about real immigration reform. We just got more deportation. So I think we learned that lesson. And with the Biden administration, like they saw the result. They saw the backlash among communities, particularly communities of color in the US. And so I'm hoping that if there's a Biden administration, if we keep up the pressure from the beginning and create that space, that we can make more progress. But I agree. I don't think anything is guaranteed. And it's really up to us to make sure that we don't get a similar reaction. Like, give us time. Like, we don't want to do anything controversial. Like, I think that will just lead to increases in deportation. It will make it much harder to not only reverse some of the worst policies under the Trump administration, but to prevent them from happening again. You have to really kind of take apart the machinery so the next person also doesn't come along and expand it. So I'm hoping there'll be some meeting of minds around that idea. And I will say that Trump has done a good job of illustrating how horrible agencies like Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, and CBP, and all of the other federal agencies and sub-agencies within that have been, and brought that to the public eye a lot more than we've seen in previous years.
Yeah, I'm curious, again, just to bring it back to this question about like changing minds, because I feel like so many people are going to be so quick to compromise. Like, there's immigration reform and they want to say, if you've ever had a DUI, then you're outside of whatever 12-year conditional residency they want to propose or something like that. And I think so many people are going to be quick to cede that ground. And so, you gave a good example of somebody in very sympathetic circumstances, obviously, 8 months pregnant and rent due. But what other kinds of things can we take to our friends or family who, they're not dealing with immigrants? And I'll be honest, a lot of my views on this have changed because of like being in the trenches with somebody and spending hours and hours developing declarations and getting to know them. And most regular people don't have the opportunity to do that. So, like, how do we do the work of changing minds on this when the opportunity comes around to get something done?
So I think some of the work that I think has given me hope is the work we do in elevating people's stories, as you mentioned, on the ground. And the way to do that, I think, is really to support local organizing. I mean, we're seeing a little microcosm of it right now as the election results are playing out, in that, like we've been all looking at Arizona, for example, and seeing the potential for change there. And people have been really tying it to local organizing on the ground for years under Sheriff Joe Arpaio, right? So you have groups like Puente, Lucha, like Mi Gente, who are really born out of this, like, show me your papers, the Arpaio parading around people in his jails in tent cities in like pink underwear, like this real demonization of people as criminals. And you did see a backlash, right? Like, it became that obvious to people on the ground. And when the people who were picked up by the police, when their kids got older, right? They're the youth who are organizing and have been organizing in Arizona and are part of the reason why, we're seeing parts of that state turn blue and possibly these election results, right? And so to me, that shows that when families feel supported and safe enough to speak out, when they can share their own stories, when the media is willing to listen, when communities are willing to fund legal services so people can stay together and be supported, when the organizations themselves are funded and supported by communities, and not just the mainstream groups in DC that often are setting the tone for policy changes. When we center that local organizing, I think the stories come out naturally because that's been the lived experience of people of color for decades. And in some of the places where it felt hopeless, like you think about how many times Sheriff Joe was reelected before he was finally ousted. And then that base, continues to this day and fighting back against the state legislation and all of that. I think that's what gives me hope that people can change their minds, that they see that this overreach. The other thing I think is the movement for Black lives. Generally speaking, the country is in a much better place than it was 5-10 years ago, and just being educated about the systemic racism in our criminal legal system. And so it's a hard leap, but it shouldn't be, for people to then see, well, if you believe that aspects of the criminal legal system are fundamentally racist, that, Black people, Latinx people are arrested and convicted and sentenced for much longer, disproportionate times, even though there's no difference in crime rates, whatnot, all of the statistics and the data, the research about the geography of policing, if you believe that, you can start to see that, and you can see that violence that communities experience when there's just an overfunding of policing and under-resourcing of other communities. And then you start to see the deportation system just kind of tacked onto that. Maybe you'll start to feel more sympathy and more empathy for the idea that a person who survived the criminal legal system to then just be placed into the deportation system and exiled from their home, maybe that will also create change through a racial justice lens. But the combination of those things, I think, can create the conditions for change. But there will need to be a narrative shift. And in some cases, really a shift in our attention away from like the pundits and the folks who've been setting the tone in Washington and towards like communities that have been demanding what they need for themselves.
Right. I do see a question, and I think it might be an apt question. And it says, what are your thoughts on abolishing ICE?
So, in favor, I'm giving a thumbs up for listeners. But what does that mean? What does abolishing ICE mean, right? Like, I think that's really the struggle. So some people hear it and think it's just like completely out there. Like, what does it mean to abolish a federal agency? Federal agencies get abolished all the time. People propose the abolishment of all sorts of different agencies. It's routine, and ICE itself.
But ICE has a long and historic presence in our country, right? I mean, they've been around since like the founding, I think. Sure.
Well, in some ways they have. The agency itself obviously is relatively new, as part of the creation of the Department of Homeland Security in 2002 into 2003. So the agency itself, that formation is new and therefore can totally be restructured without as much chaos as one might think. But yeah, the concept actually, people aren't wrong when they say, but no, ICE has been around forever. In a way it has, since the creation of federal immigration law, and really since the emphasis on Chinese exclusion. That's when you started to see this idea of needing a federal agency to enforce immigration law. And it's actually been interesting to see how it moves from Department of Labor, Department of Commerce into Department of Treasury. And then you start to see, okay, Department of Justice and now Department of Homeland Security. It's kind of like a metaphor for what we think of immigrants over time. And so I think the main issue is that we don't need a federal agency whose job it is to criminalize immigrants, to screen them as threats, to exile them from the country. What would it look like if we had a federal agency that was focused on helping immigrants come to the United States, helping them thrive here, providing humanitarian assistance, providing support that people need to move? And when people think that seems like a radical idea, it's really, again, about like class and race. Like, if you are a rich, white person from any of the richest countries in the world, you already have open borders. You're already able to take your passport and travel anywhere you want for any reason. We allow money and labor to flow freely, right? And the question is, why do we then create a system that's designed to exploit people, to make it so hard for certain groups to come here? rather than just accepting that we need to identify what the actual problems are and regulate those problems, not people, but the actual issues. We care about workers' rights and protecting American workers. People should be on an even playing field. We shouldn't have whole classes of people excluded just because they weren't born here. If we care about public safety, and I think about this often with my clients who've had contact in the criminal legal system, rather than spending thousands of dollars to deport someone after they finally got drug treatment, got back on their feet, and are now, becoming a counselor to people in their community, why not actually put that money into drug treatment so they didn't have this issue in the first place? I think we're using immigration to distract ourselves from the real problems that we have a genuine need to be worried about, and having a whole agency devoted to policing immigrants, particularly in the interior of this country, I think just demonstrates how we're diverting our resources into an agency that's really been a very rogue agency and has caused a lot of pain in communities and really doesn't have anything to show for themselves in terms of problems that they've solved and solutions that they've given to the American people.
Yeah, I mean, it would be nice if when people came in, they were able to get things like work permits so they could get driver's licenses. And think about that, like how many of our clients get into criminal issues because they don't have a driver's license, right? Or they're having to, work unlawfully, like Stephen's client has to go out and get a fake Social Security card. But yeah, I mean, I think most of ICE's things that they do that we recognize, they don't really need to do. We don't need them to do that. Whenever you get in this conversation long enough with someone, they'll talk about sex trafficking and all that. And okay, I mean, we can keep them for maybe those isolated things, but I don't think as an agency we really need them anymore. I know Stephen's a big fan, right? Big shout out to all the people in his ERO field office.
Yeah. I had a colleague today, he texted me, he said that he had court and the judge referenced his recent Twitter thread or storm or whatever. So I love ICE. They're great. Don't deport my clients. I will say, okay, I'm not, that's, whatever. It's a slogan, it feels like, and it does feel like there was a time like during Operation Wetback when we didn't have ICE and there were sheriffs doing it, local cops and sheriffs, deporting people suspected of being Mexican. And at some point we said, oh, well, we better push that to the federal level. And if you abolish ICE without fundamentally changing the law, there's always the risk that they shift it back to INS or gets driven down to the local level. And then you're just in a situation where you have really bad laws just waiting to be enforced by, whoever, which is a little bit what we saw with Obama, Trump. Obama 2014 to 16, lots of discretion, lots of people allowed into the country. Lots of people had their cases shelved. And then Trump, came in and removed all that discretion. And I have been thinking a little bit just about how unhealthy it's going to be if it continues this way, a back and forth, and what that does to the psyche of people in these communities, and to have this constant back and forth. But yeah, I'm a big ICE guy. So.
Yeah, no, there has to be a change in the laws. And on the issues that I work on, I've been really happy to see the New Way Forward bill come out as a potential model for how you start to roll back some of these all get traced to the 1996 laws under the Clinton administration that really expanded the criminal grounds for deportation and detention. I think there's a lot of movement around recognizing the real evil in immigration detention itself. And so I hope we'll see more progressive legislation there as a possibility too. And the truth is, we all have worked with ICE officers in our clients' cases. And I've seen a change in them. I've seen cases where officers, you could tell in their heads, they're like, I don't want to be doing this, but I'm doing this. And there's something about the system itself, the agency itself, that is fundamentally flawed, where you can have folks who believe very differently than I do about the system, who could still be in it and still actually be like, this is wrong. I know it's wrong. I don't want to be doing this, but I am. And that to me is exhibit A for why that agency has to go. It's not about the people. It's about the system itself, which is set up to really target immigrant communities.
To be fair, under Obama, there's ICE officers who were doing the I really don't want to be doing this, but I have to, and they're letting your client go free. So, there are a lot of ICE officers who really relish what they do.
No, it's definitely true. And it's true for how we think about policing too, about a lot of fundamental issues. But I think the bottom line is that we have to change the laws and the system, funding structures. It's not just about bad apples. It really is about the system as a whole.
One thing that just, I guess the last thing, every time I post on Twitter or somewhere about a really sympathetic case, oh, this guy has, been here or whatever for a long time, and now he's being deported or facing deportation. I always get people chiming in saying, well, how come he hasn't applied yet for his green card? And so I always say, if we could just get the immigration system that exists in the minds of conservatives, then we would be on a path to, something just, because in their minds, hey, if you've kind of been here a while, you go down to the paper store and you pay the thing and then you get your green card. And I think that should be the way it is. So that would go a long ways. And hopefully we get some other positive changes here soon. Hopefully. But
hopefully.
I really appreciate that. Thank you all for your time and being here with us today. This was a real treat for me to listen to.